This was shocking to me. And what really bothered me about this was sort of the direct connection between this statistic and the narrative that so many women, myself included, grew up being told. Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, season 2. I apologize if I'm a little rusty. It's been a few weeks, and we had a really productive few weeks off. I'm so glad that we took the time to kind of take a step back and think about what we want to do with this next batch of episodes. But I'm not going to lie, when Monday or Tuesday came around, I definitely missed sitting down and talking to all of you. So I'm very excited to be back. And honestly, this week's topic I don't think could come at a better time. This week, we are talking about birth control. As I've gotten better at managing some of the more mental health focused challenges in my life over the course of the last year or so, I've started to shift my focus to include prioritizing my physical health also. Not to mention, it's springtime, it's getting warmer outside, it's staying lighter longer, and I don't know about you, but that always makes me want to get outside and sort of move my body. I have a few physical health goals that I'm going to be trying to complete in the next couple of months that I'm also really excited to share with you. I've been wanting to challenge myself in a new way lately, and I feel like this is kind of the perfect way for me to do that with where I'm at right now. But in the meantime, I want to talk about birth control. I am sure that I'm not the only one who's come across the Washington Post article that's been circulating lately titled, "Women are getting off birth control amid misinformation explosion." Birth control is something that I have personal experience with. It's something that affects both your physical and your mental health, and I personally felt like the article was a bit misleading. It didn't really sit well with me, and this is a big sister topic, so this seemed like the perfect way to kick off season 2 of It's Not Normal. I want to jump right in with a quote from this article that I think will give you a feel for sort of the overall tone of the piece. It says, "Physicians say they're seeing an explosion of birth control misinformation online, targeting a vulnerable demographic, people in their teens and early 20s, who are more likely to believe what they see on their phones because of algorithms that feed them a stream of videos reinforcing messages often divorced from scientific evidence. While doctors say hormonal contraception, which includes birth control pills and IUDs, is safe and effective, they worry the profession's long-standing lack of transparency about some of the serious but rare side effects has left many patients seeking information from unqualified online communities." Now, this article was written by 2 women, which right off the bat is kind of disappointing considering the contents, the overall message, the tone of the article. But the first red flag that I want to address is labeling women's real lived experiences as misinformation, claiming that searching birth control on TikTok, and I quote, "will lead you to a cascade of misleading videos vilifying hormonal contraception, blaming weight gain on the pill, complaining of depression and anxiety." The language, I think, is already so derogatory. Misinformation, I think, is a real problem, especially on social media, unfortunately, but I personally don't believe that the spread of misinformation is the leading cause of women ultimately making the decision to stop taking hormonal birth control. Misinformation, I think, becomes a problem when people just blindly follow it. When people see something and instantly just take on those opinions or those facts as their own. They think that it's true, they think that it's right, and they never really think to question it or to actually conduct any of their own research to back up whatever it is that they were listening to or reading. That, I think, is when it becomes a problem. And because of the nature of birth control, I think when you're deciding whether or not you want to continue to take the pill or to go on the pill, I don't think that that's a decision that women typically make as a result of blindly following something that they might see online. It has physical and mental side effects, and I think, at least even in my personal experience, when I would see other women talking about their experience with hormonal birth control, all it did was validate my own experience. And so it sort of piqued my interest and it prompted me to do a bit more research so that I could make the decision that was right for me. I didn't sort of take anything and everything that I was absorbing or learning about birth control, everyone else's perspectives, and sort of take those on as my own, and then ultimately blindly make a decision to do or not to do something that's going to impact my physical and emotional health. So now I just want to run through a couple of the different forms of birth control because after all, this is big sister content and this is stuff that I wish I knew about when I was younger, when I was first starting to take birth control or even think about taking it. I wanted to know what my options were. I didn't know that I had other options beside a pill. So we've got a number of different options when it comes to preventing pregnancy. Other than abstinence, the big A, and condoms, we've got a patch, a ring, a shot, a pill, IUDs, and a handful of other methods. Now, before I get too far into this topic, I just want to reiterate that I am not a professional. I don't claim to be one. All I'm relaying to you is my own personal experience, my perspective, and the information that I've found in the research that I've done. I feel pretty comfortable and confident with the things that I've come up with, which is why I'm sharing it with you. But just keep in mind, like I said earlier, take all of this with a grain of salt. This is all secondary to the insight and the education of actual healthcare professionals. So just keep that in mind. All right, now that that's out of the way, I want to talk about the effectiveness of these different forms of birth control. Everything that I just mentioned sort of ranges in effectiveness from about 93 to 96% if being used properly. And most of them contain either progestin or a combination of progestin and estrogen, which basically stops ovulation. So that means that there's no egg there to be fertilized. And most of them do come with sort of a mixed bag of side effects, everything ranging from nausea, irregular periods, your boobs might hurt, anxiety, depression, weight gain, lower sex drive, all the way up to the more rare and more serious side effects that some women have experienced, like increasing your risk of heart attack, stroke, blood clots. But one of the most underrated symptoms of hormonal birth control, in my opinion, is that brain fog that you experience. I've talked to other women in my life who have been on the pill and then proceeded to kind of take steps back and look into alternative methods of contraception. And they shared similar experiences where they described it as sort of a veil being lifted once they stopped taking the pill. It was one of those side effects that they didn't even know that they were experiencing until after they stopped taking hormonal birth control. And then suddenly they were clear-minded, they were able to focus more, things seemed more vibrant, and they felt more in tune with their bodies. As a lot of you know, anyone who's listened to season 1 of the podcast, for most of my life, I was completely naive to the fact that my parent was emotionally immature. I thought that my experience with my family, sort of the way that my family functioned, was a relatively universal experience. I thought most families functioned that way. And it wasn't until I started sharing my own experience online that I was finally able to realize that I wasn't alone in that. I was able to realize how abnormal and unhealthy it actually was. And so many of us have been able to offer up our own unique perspectives and sort of learn and grow from one another. And I think the same thing is sort of happening right now with birth control. It's no surprise that I'm sure a lot of us in our teens or even our early 20s made sort of an uninformed decision to ultimately start taking the hormonal birth control pill, because I thought that that's just what everyone did. I thought that that was kind of my only option, and I didn't know that there were any side effects. That was just kind of what it seemed like everyone was doing. That was what was talked about in health class. And so I didn't know that there were other options out there, and I didn't necessarily know what to expect. It just kind of seemed like a given. Like once you were ready to be sexually active, that was kind of the thing that you did. So I first started taking the pill about 5 years ago at this point, maybe a little longer. And I remember going to my mom and basically just saying like, I think it's kind of time. And she was like, okay, we'll get you on the pill. And that was it. There was really no discussion around it. And I do not by any means blame my mom for this. I don't think that she, like a lot of us, knew that there were a lot of other forms or options in terms of birth control. I think that just sort of seemed like proper procedure. And so once I was ready to be sexually active, or if I was in a relationship, it was kind of just like, okay, you're going to get on the pill. And that was that. And I think this just reinforces how important it is for women to feel comfortable talking about their experience with different forms of birth control. I think about, if I had seen other women like me talking about the different forms of birth control that they had tried, what our different options are, what the side effects of these different options are, and things to look out for, that would have educated me and informed me and maybe saved me a little bit of grief for the next couple of years. And what's so upsetting about this Washington Post article is when it mentions that TikTok and Instagram and other social media outlets are censoring some content where women are speaking negatively about birth control. And that's really upsetting to me because, similar with mental health topics, I think perspective is absolutely invaluable. So I started taking the pill. I was taking a combination pill, which means that it contains both progestin and estrogen. And the presence of the hormone estrogen in the combination pill is typically what increases your risk for developing blood clots. And there are different anecdotal stories in both this article and another article that I'm going to mention. But again, I didn't even know that there were different options for the pill. I thought it was sort of like the same pill for everyone, but they just had different brand names. And so I started taking the pill right around the time that I suddenly moved out of my parents' house. And looking back, that was such a traumatic experience. It was a very emotionally draining, intense, stressful time. And for a long time, I associated whatever negative emotions I might have been experiencing throughout the day or the week or the month for extended periods of time directly to what was going on in my own personal life with my family. I had a much harder time dealing with stress. I feel like my anxiety spiked. It went through the roof. I developed separation anxiety for the first time, and I felt completely unable to cope with it in any way, shape, or form. I was crying so much more than I ever had. I remember one day driving to work in my car and this song came on the radio and I just burst into tears. And I didn't know why. I wasn't feeling sad. The song wasn't particularly emotional, but I was inconsolable. I could not help myself. And I also remember feeling really paranoid at certain times and I just couldn't shake those feelings. It was really awful, but I think I attributed all of those negative emotions, again, to what was going on in my personal life at the time. It seemed logical, it seemed to make sense. And again, not knowing anything about the side effects of hormonal birth control, I never thought that there was a connection between the two. I still remember the night that I decided that I was going to stop taking the pill. My husband and I were working, we were in our shop, and we had a bit of a disagreement or a stressful conversation, and I just remember being hysterical. I was crying. And in the past, even though I was naive to the emotional manipulation that I was enduring at the hands of my narcissistic parent, in really stressful, negative situations, I always felt really capable of managing my emotions. And not only my emotions, right, but the emotions of another person in my life. I felt like I was always the person to kind of offer up that positive reinforcement, that reassurance. Let's look at the bright side. And I didn't typically dwell on things. I didn't think that stress got to me very much. And I think this was partially because I was naive, but I definitely think that my ability to handle more negative emotions was impacted by birth control. So I remember just being totally inconsolable and crying and not being able to stop crying. And I felt stressed and I felt, I think, to an extent, that fog. And so I remember after that conversation, my husband and I were sitting in the car and I was still crying. And I just said to him, this isn't me. I don't feel like myself anymore and I don't know what to do. And so I think at that point, I had started to learn just a little bit about the side effects of hormonal birth control. I think just because as things were shifting and changing with my relationship, with my family, a lot of the more negative side effects kind of continued. They remained consistent. And so it wasn't adding up as much to me anymore. And sure enough, the more research that I had done, things started to click and I started to make the connection between the two. And so I figured if there's even a possibility that me taking the hormonal birth control pill is contributing to my inability to handle any kind of stress or frustration, if it's increasing my anxiety, then it's worth trying something new. Because, I always felt so in tune with my body pre-birth control. And I remember, even before really knowing about any of the side effects, I think the idea of taking a pill every single day at the same time from now until whenever, and the little bit that I had heard from other girls or friends of mine saying, oh, sometimes it makes me feel a bit more emotional, or, just minor sort of anecdotal stories, I was hesitant to start taking the pill in the first place because I had always felt like I had a really good sort of natural balance of hormones. I always felt really in tune with my body. And so it just felt weird, I guess. But again, I thought that was kind of my only option. It seemed like everyone did it. So I didn't think too much about it. Even when I went to my gynecologist to get the prescription for birth control for the first time, no one told me about what the other kinds of contraception were, about any of the other forms of contraception. No one asked me about my lifestyle, my preferences, if I was hesitant at all, if I knew about the side effects. It was just a very quick sort of in and out, okay, here you go, here's the prescription, and that's that. Kind of assuming that I had already done the research, that I knew everything, that I didn't need any kind of guidance. And I don't know, I think that's a major flaw in a lot of women's experiences interacting with doctors, especially surrounding the topic of birth control. It's kind of like, okay, we've got this pill. It's so common. It's so widely used. Why does there need to be a discussion, right? If this is what you're coming in and asking for, then that's that. I'm just going to assume that you know everything. And I think that we can really do better on that front. So that night, my husband and I went home and we started researching the different types of contraception, different methods of birth control. And I ultimately decided on the copper IUD. I have the Paragard IUD and I've had it for the last 3 years. In the research that we were doing, it seemed like the physical side effects of the copper IUD were a bit more intense than most of the other forms of birth control. My period before I started taking the pill was already pretty light to begin with. And once I started taking the pill, it was even lighter. It would last 4 days. I would have a regular tampon in on like my heaviest days and feel completely safe leaving the house. My cramps were very minimal. And so that was a positive for me. And I know that, again, that's one of the reasons that even young girls in high school who may not be sexually active, start taking a hormonal birth control pill to help them manage really intense period symptoms, sometimes even to help with acne with their skin. And so it did have sort of a positive side effect for me in that way. And in doing some research about the IUD, it seemed like compared to the other forms of birth control, like I said, the physical side of things was going to be a bit more intense. Longer periods, heavier periods, more intense cramping. But what was so important for me and why the copper IUD really stood out is that it was one of the few options that had no hormones. And that was what was really more important for me. That was my main priority. Because I remember thinking to myself, I can handle physical pain symptoms much better than I can handle an emotional sort of mental side effect where my hormones are out of whack and these things are kind of happening that are outside of my control, right? If I have longer periods, okay, so be it. If they're heavier, I can take care of that. If my cramping is worse, I can deal. Right? But if I've got things that are going on that are messing with the different naturally occurring hormones in my body, where I'm no longer able to handle stress or kind of cope with negative emotions, that I can't do very much about. So I was willing to kind of let the physical side effects fall by the wayside and just kind of deal with them so that I could reap the benefits of, once again, just letting my natural balance of hormones kind of take over. Now, with the copper IUD, it can last for up to 10 years, which is great. And apparently there's no effect on your ability to get pregnant once it's been removed, which is another plus. Now, there are side effects to the copper IUD also, some rare, but again, serious side effects like it getting dislodged, kind of falling out of place, or perforating the lining of your uterine wall. Nothing in the medical field, I don't think, is entirely foolproof. And, when we're talking about contraception, I think the only way to entirely 100% prevent pregnancy without any risk of any negative side effect is probably abstinence. So I go to get the IUD inserted, and wow, was it painful. No pain medication, no even real disclaimer beforehand. They just said, maybe when you get home, take a Tylenol, try not to have anything else that you really need to get done for the day, and just take it easy. And it was a really intense pain. It was a pain unlike anything that I had really felt before. It felt like an intense pressure in my sort of lower abdomen, like internally. It's really hard to describe, but it was awful. And luckily, my husband had come with me, so he drove home, and I was just kind of curled up in the fetal position the entire drive home. And when I went home that night, I took an ibuprofen, I sat on the couch, I had my hot water bottle on my belly, and that was that. So the insertion itself kind of sucked, but again, at the forefront of my mind was, okay, this is going to be an effective form of birth control, and there are no hormones. So it seemed like the physical side of things was worth it for what I would hopefully be gaining emotionally. Now, in the Washington Post article, they touch on how a lot of the reported side effects of birth control typically resolve themselves in due time. My periods for the first 6 months to a year after I had the IUD inserted lasted anywhere from 26 to 35 days, which is anxiety inducing for anyone, especially if you were like me, and before that, you were always dead on 28 days apart. And it's nothing to really shrug your shoulders at. Not only was the timing a bit anxiety inducing, but my periods were much longer. They were much heavier. I went from always having sort of a 4 or 5 day period where I felt comfortable leaving the house with just a regular tampon, and that was it, to now my periods were lasting a full 7 days, sometimes even 8 days. And for the entire middle chunk, kind of days 2 through 4 or 5, I couldn't go longer than 3 hours without bleeding through a super tampon. And my cramps were so much more intense than they had ever been. When I was younger, I got my period pretty late, which I was always pretty thankful for. I was very active when I was a kid. I had very minimal cramping. And so this was kind of a complete switch up than everything than I had been used to. And, did these side effects resolve themselves and kind of level out eventually? Yes. But dealing with them for the better part of a year is incredibly inconvenient. And like I said, it's nothing to shrug your shoulders at. And so I think it's really important for us, doctors included, doctors especially, to really listen to women when they're speaking about their really honest, valid concerns about birth control. What are their symptoms? What are they experiencing? And I think that was one of the parts of this article that really kind of upset me, because it seemed like it was kind of nonchalant. Oh, these negative side effects of birth control that you might experience, sure, they're there, but in time they'll go away. A year is a long time. And when you're dealing with something every single month for a year, it dominates a lot of your thought process and how you live your life and the decisions that you make. Within the first 1 to 3 months, I want to say, of having the IUD though, I was already starting to feel much more like myself emotionally, mentally. I could feel a difference because I started to feel like me again. I was able to handle stress and frustration way more similarly to how I had pre-birth control, which I was so excited about. I felt so happy to have found kind of a solution. Again, even though the physical side effects were kind of sucky, I was so happy to be feeling clearer headed, like I could focus more, like I could handle more negative situations without crying or feeling completely overwhelmed. My anxiety even started to calm down a little bit, and I wasn't spontaneously bursting into tears anymore, so that was a plus. It's been about 3 years since I've had the IUD inserted, and now my periods are much more regular. Days 2 and 3 still totally suck. They're still really heavy. But I think that's a pretty universal experience for most women, whether or not they're on or have been on any kind of hormonal birth control. Overall, I would say that I've had a generally positive experience with the copper IUD. And the lack of side effects in terms of my mental and emotional health has probably been the best part of the entire experience. So naturally, having had this experience in my own personal life and coming across this article, kind of seeing a lot of different people talking about it, I felt compelled to do a bit more research about the long-term effects of hormonal birth control. And so in a New York Post article titled "Why More Women Like Me Are Abandoning the Pill Over Emerging Health Concerns," the author shares her own experience about starting hormonal birth control as a sophomore in high school. And she goes on to interview Dr. Sarah Hill, who is an evolutionary psychologist who in 2019 published a book called "This Is Your Brain on Birth Control: The Surprising Science of Women, Hormones, and the Law of Unintended Consequences." The article goes on to discuss a decrease in oral contraceptive use between the early 2000s and the mid-20-teens, noting that women throughout that time were keen on, quote, limiting their body's exposure to outside hormones so that they can feel more natural and like themselves. What's wrong with that? I think this is really important because women themselves are saying that when they stopped taking hormonal birth control, they started to feel more like themselves again. I think these are very valid concerns that we need to be listening to. And what's upsetting to me about the Washington Post article is that they're labeling women's real lived experiences, negative experiences with hormonal birth control, as misinformation that's being spread on social media, and that being the leading cause of women now making the decision to stop taking a hormonal birth control pill, when in reality, women just want to feel more in tune with themselves, more like their natural selves, without exposing their bodies to outside hormones. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. As someone who has dealt with emotional abuse and the mental health challenges that go along with that, what really stood out to me in this article was when Dr. Hill talked about how the pill affects the way that women handle stressful situations. Normally, your body's response to a stressful situation is to release the hormone cortisol, and women on the pill, quote, have a dulled or completely absent cortisol response. As a result, they have a diminished capacity to process negative emotions. According to Dr. Hill, the stress hormone profiles of women who are on the birth control pill look more like those belonging to trauma victims than they do like those belonging to otherwise healthy young women. This was shocking to me. And what really bothered me about this was sort of the direct connection between this statistic, this information, and the narrative that so many women, myself included, grew up being told. That women are crazy, so emotional, too sensitive. Even though I grew up in a female-dominated household, I always felt uncomfortable talking about things that were specifically related to women. Boobs, bras, vaginas, periods. If I ever needed to grab a pad from the hallway closet, I felt like I had to do it really quickly and kind of quietly. If I ever had to pass my sister a pad while we were out in public, I felt like I had to do it on the low. It was something to be ashamed of, like I was doing a drug deal. I felt like I had to compensate for other people's discomfort with something that was completely naturally occurring in half the population. It was very much the environment that I grew up in, unfortunately, one of those where I felt misunderstood as a woman. It was sort of that, well, sure, you have to deal with periods, but we have to deal with you on your period kind of mentality, which it makes me gag, honestly, to say it out loud, like, grow up. And yet at the same time, I had no perspective. And so I just remember never wanting to be that stereotypical emotional girl. The emotions that you experience throughout the different stages of your menstrual cycle were never explained to me. I was never encouraged to kind of lean into them or to understand what they mean. Even now, I've done so much more of a deep dive into this that I understand why at different times of my cycle, I feel different emotionally, socially, physically, and how to best kind of cater my lifestyle and my decisions throughout my cycle to best suit how I'm feeling in the moment. It was very much the opposite in the environment that I grew up in. I thought that the less I acted like a girl, if I never talked about my period, if I pretended like my cramps did not exist, if I never mentioned feeling upset or letting myself get too emotional, like that in some way or another would make me an objectively more attractive girl. Not in a physical sense, but just easier to be around, because I felt like any girl-related issues were kind of a nuisance to anyone who wasn't a girl, which is honestly a little devastating. But now I read this article that kind of breaks down how probably the most popular, widely used form of contraception among women, the hormonal birth control pill, has a significant impact and a direct connection to our ability to handle stressful situations and process negative emotions. It's no secret that women's healthcare research is consistently underfunded. I've learned in the research that I've done, only 2% of revenue from the pill goes back into research and development. And so not only are so many women shouldering the responsibility of preventing unwanted pregnancies in relationships, but our options are so limited and feed into this false narrative that ties these really negative, unfounded traits directly to our characteristics as a gender, which is so upsetting to me. It's like, here, take this thing that we're making your responsibility. I'm not going to tell you how it's going to make you feel, but it's going to maybe make you feel a little crazy. And then I'm going to call you out for being crazy and just assume that it's part of who you are. It's so backwards. And so in the Washington Post article, they interviewed a male OBGYN, which I have nothing against male OBGYNs, but to comment on an article like this, I don't know how you can speak confidently on something that you never have or never will experience, which is always something that's bothered me even in politics, when you've got these older males sort of making decisions about women's bodies and the rights that we have. When you are not a woman yourself, you don't understand what it's like. It doesn't really make sense to me, but that's a conversation for another day. But he said, quote, "People are putting themselves out there as experts on birth control and speaking to things that science does not bear out," which I think is completely false. I think a lot of the negative side effects that are being talked about and censored on social media are completely grounded. I think there's evidence to back a lot of them. But I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of women are taking to social media, not only to share their own experiences, but also as a source of information. It's because a lot of them feel like they're being gaslit by their doctors, like they're not taking their symptoms or their concerns very seriously if they can even get in front of a doctor at all. I'm about to turn 27. This is going to be my first year on my own healthcare plan. And because I'm self-employed, I don't get healthcare provided through an employer. And so I have to do this myself. And I applied at the end of the year last year. And I still, 4 months into the year, have not heard anything back. I've submitted my application, I sent in the necessary documents that they needed, and I've called a handful of times to check on the status of my application. When am I going to hear back? Do I need to send anything else in? And every single time I've called, they've told me the same thing, that they're so backed up to give them another 45 days. They've got so much going on and they'll eventually get to it. But now, what if I need to go to the gynecologist? What if I get sick and something happens? Am I covered? Do I have health care or health insurance? I don't know. I think the system is so flawed, and so I don't necessarily think it's always easy for women to take their questions or concerns to a medical professional, to a healthcare professional, because in my case right now, it's hard to even get in front of a doctor. Before I was off the plan that I was on up until this point in my life, I tried to make some appointments just for physicals so that I could make sure that I was in good health just in case something like this did happen and I was uncertain of my healthcare coverage for a little while. I was calling in November, and the earliest that these doctors were saying that they could take me was in April. For blood work, for a physical. It's getting to the point where it's a little unrealistic. And so sometimes, if you're looking for some perspective, for a little bit of guidance or advice, social media becomes the place to do that, because at your fingertips for free, you have thousands of different perspectives and experiences that you can access. You have different communities of people who offer up their own perspective, and maybe you can take something positive from that. And all of these natural remedies that they're talking about as sort of alternatives to hormonal birth control, like cycle syncing and the symptothermal method, which I really don't know much about, but they're being dispelled by the Washington Post article as ineffective, and I don't think they're as ineffective as the article makes them seem. Granted, I think anytime you're going with a more natural approach to birth control, where you're entirely relying on yourself, maybe taking your own temperature, syncing your cycle, making sure you know exactly when it is that you're ovulating, when you're fertile, when you have a chance to be pregnant, I think it might be a lot harder to learn and perfect those methods so that they're entirely foolproof. But I think if that's something that you're willing to go through with, and that's kind of the best decision for your own lifestyle, if that's really what you want to do, I think that's fine. And I think that those methods can be effective if done properly. I, for one, especially in today's day and age, I don't think there's anything wrong with moving towards, or at least entertaining the idea of more natural alternatives. I am always in my own life kind of pushing towards that, whether it's, organic materials with my clothing or my bedding, or, buying food at the grocery store that have less artificial colors or flavors or preservatives. I think a lot of what's on the shelves and what's out there today isn't entirely transparent. I don't think it's always exactly what it says it is, which I think kind of sometimes feeds into people feeling like they have to sort of conduct their own research. There's sort of a lack of trust, I think, that's been developing on a lot of different fronts. Everything from healthcare to hair care to food to clothing to big box stores, and where all of these things are being produced and how they're being produced. So I personally don't think that there's anything wrong with seeking more natural alternatives so long as you do your own research. Now, this is where things start to get even more fucked up, I think. In the Washington Post article, it talks about how conservative politicians are weaponizing the push to move away from hormonal birth control towards more natural methods as a reason to limit or restrict access to birth control. Which, these two things are not the same. Women's health care is not a political issue. It's a human issue, and the fact that politicians are using these very real, very valid concerns to further their own agendas is so disheartening. The answer is not restricting access. The answer is more access to information. The answer is more research and development of more, better options so that women can continue to be proactive in preventing unwanted pregnancies without having to endure the side effects that so many of us currently are with the options that are available. If there's one thing that I've learned since sharing my experience on social media, it's been that all I am and all we all are experts in our own experience. No one has more agency to make a decision for you than you. And I think it's important, especially with all of these things circulating, to really remember to take everything that you consume on social media, even what I'm saying, with a grain of salt. Use these platforms and these ideas that you're exposing yourself to kind of broaden your horizons and see whatever it is that piques your interest, and take that and conduct your own research. Seek out medical professionals, healthcare providers, whatever the actual topic might be. If you're interested in something and you want to start implementing that in your life, fact check it. Don't just blindly take it to the bank and start applying that to your life. Do your own research so you can make an educated decision that's actually best for you and your life. The possibility of having our access to birth control restricted, especially in a post-Roe world. I'm recording this just coming off of learning about the Arizona Supreme Court decision to uphold a 160-year-old law that bans abortions in Arizona. It's terrifying. And while hormonal birth control might be unnatural, if you feel that that's the right decision for you in your life right now, that's completely fine. And I'm sure there are plenty of women out there who have had great experiences with the hormonal birth control pill and with different forms of hormonal birth control, and that's completely fine. I think what's really important is just to leave the stage open for any women who want to speak up about their experiences, both positive or negative, with any form of birth control that they've experimented with, so that they can offer up their own perspective and other women can learn from them. They can get ideas. They can know, okay, these are what my different options are. Now let me go and start to conduct my own research to see what will be best suited for my lifestyle. I am not here to draw conclusions, to try to tell you what to do, to advise you in one direction or another. My experience has been and always will be to share my own experience, offer up my perspective, and sort of relay the information that I've gathered throughout my research with you. Again, take all of this with a grain of salt. This is just my own experience, and because I feel this way and I've experienced these things, and maybe these things have worked for me, that doesn't necessarily mean that the case will be the same for you. I hope with this episode, even if you are on the pill and maybe you're just experiencing some heightened anxiety, maybe sex doesn't appeal to you as much as it once did, I hope that offering up this perspective will maybe allow you to start to take steps to understand more about why that is. I'm really glad that this conversation is happening. I think it's a really important conversation to have, and I'm excited to be a part of it. So thank you so much for listening, and I would absolutely love to hear your feedback on this episode. Let me know what you thought. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like it, subscribe to my channel. If you're listening on Spotify, be sure to leave us a rating. I feel so ready to kind of diversify, and this season feels like the perfect opportunity to include a much broader range of topics, but it'll always be me. And so for that reason, mental health topics will always sort of make their way into the conversation, just like with this week's episode. But it feels like an evolution. And I just want to thank everybody who's been supporting me in this from the very beginning. And yeah, once again, I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.